Disa Senta, Skadura, you want to flutna, is not Skadura, So first I want to introduce myself. My name is Brennen Ferguson. I'm from the Tuscarora Nation, the Turtle Clan, and I sit on the Tuscarora Nation Council for the Turtle Clan. And I'll also admit that I'm an adjunct professor here at NU, and I teach Tuscarora culture in the springtime. And so I was asked to come here and open with some of our words. So it's just to explain a little bit, it's Haudenosaunee custom that when we come together for any reason of significance, via a ceremony or a council or a community meeting, any meeting where we're coming together for a purpose, our ancestors laid it out for us, and we'll first open with these words to bring our minds together. So I'll start with that. Ona fata anad diutariha kanyuni ekina ratas. Ona wagaha aguri hoya agihra kanika uriha. Ona hasna na wet wet na ina gatkwani. I thought to get gafna kanika diga watakya. Una hasna igwa de rutra disna nat vatna haratas disna igwadi huatata. Twa ikwageha na afnakya. Ana neon ne ka igwa diga rutna una chakwa diga. Una hasna twa ka diga and was disna nekin haratas ha igwa abufna. Hasna twa igwadi huatata twa akinikka yikiyawi twa never dawajuha kiana ari gotag. Disna twa igwadi huatata twa ramadiya yana abufna kana era disna urahiga. Hasna igwadi huatata ha igwa abufna. Ana neon ne ka igwa diga rutna una chakwa diga. Wana hasna twa ka diga and was disna nekin haratas ha ikiguana skana dariyo. Hasna twa igwadi huatata sachi raweru wahra twa atnuwit dawa harawadya na hatarahiwakya. Una igwa eneri hakari was. Disna twa and what diga rarutra disna wayuhra igwadi huatata ha heptak diga igwastapya gaira igihruna. Disna haka diga ragwasna disna haka diga ragwasna na igwa nerutra. Hasna igwadi huatata ha ikiguana skana dariyo disna ha heptak diga igwastapya. Ana neon ne ka igwa diga rutna una chakwa diga. Una hasna twa ka diga and was disna nekin haratas arawadya na hatarahiwakya. Una twa igwadi huatata chwakya twa kanikka yikiyawi twa neko dawajuha kiana ariyakotak. Disna neko twa igwadi huatata chwakya twa arawadya kiana arufna kana era disna urahiga. Hasna igwadi huatata harawadya na tarahiwakya. Ana neon ne ka igwa diga rutna una chakwa diga. Una igwati hua gel igwa wata naso una chakwa diga una hatu. And so just a brief translation. Our ancestors, as Haudenosaunee, our ancestors recognize that when we come together like this from all different backgrounds, we carry with us different baggage and different issues are on our minds. And so to help relieve that baggage and those issues that are pulling on our minds, they open with these words to help us focus. And they do this by acknowledging all the different levels of creation. And so we start with the people that have gathered here today, and we give our collective greetings and our thanks for each other. We give thanks that all of us are here. We give thanks that we all made it here safely. And from that point, we extend that greetings to all the people of the world and acknowledge that everyone is doing their best to keep these things going. From there, we move on to our Mother, the Earth. We acknowledge her, we greet her, and we thank her that she continues her duties that were given to her by our Creator. And at that point, we touch on all the different levels of creation. The animals, the fish, the birds, the trees, they were all given duties by our Creator. And we acknowledge that we give our thanks that they continue their duties. because we know that we're dependent on them. We know that as human beings, we cannot do our work if they ignore their duties. So with one mind, we acknowledge them and we greet them, and we give them our appreciation that they continue their work. And once we get higher and higher into the sky and the sky world, we acknowledge our different relatives of the sky. We describe the sun as our eldest brother. We describe the moon as our grandmother, the thunderers as our grandfathers. And similarly, we acknowledge that they have responsibilities. And we greet them and we acknowledge them. And we thank them for continuing their responsibilities. Because again, we're dependent on those things as well. As we get closer to the Creator's land, we acknowledge that as Haudenosaunee people in particular, we've had times when we face a lot of issues, social issues, and there were times and different times in our history when we were almost done away with. We could have been extinct. And during those times, our Creator sent us messengers, and He sent us guidance for how we can continue into the future. And so we greet those messengers, and we offer them our thanks and our appreciation for what they did for us in our history so that we can continue into the future. And then lastly, we get to our Creator Himself. And we similarly, we greet Him and we acknowledge Him with our one mind. And we thank Him because He was the one who thought of us when He first put us here on this earth. He offered us His breath so that we could experience life, so that we could learn how to be a human being here on earth. And He did that for us, so we offer Him our thanks. And then lastly, I address the people again and I say that if there was something that I missed, that you fill that in your own mind. That if my words were lacking, I wasn't trying to offend anybody. And so in your own minds, make those greetings complete when I had to.
Thank you, Brennen Ferguson, for opening our convening with the Ganaher Tetra. Niagara University acknowledges that we are privileged to gather on the lands of the Tuscarora and Seneca nations and other indigenous communities who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We honor their sovereignty, demonstrate respect, and correct the stories and practices that have erased indigenous peoples' history and culture by inviting and honoring truth. As a university striving for inclusive excellence, we believe that truth and recognition are critical components to building connections across all barriers of heritage and differences. We offer land acknowledgement as part of the conscious effort to affirm our commitment to be better stewards of the land on which we stand and to pledge to work in partnership with the spirit of mutual respect and collaboration. Niagara University appreciates and regards the traditions of our community's diverse cultures. My name is Tamara Miner, and I have the pleasure of helping Niagara University lead its efforts to create a more diverse and inclusive, equitable community of educators, administrators, and learners. What I just read to you is the University Land Acknowledgement. This statement is one way of recognizing and honoring the indigenous people who were the original stewards of this land before European settlers arrived. But a land acknowledgement is just a start. It is a way of acknowledging a past dark history and a beginning to develop the actions that need to take place to move us forward. And forward is exactly where we are headed, and that's why the work that we're doing here at Niagara is so critical. Under the leadership of Father James Marr, we spent the past couple of years enacting plans to ensure that everyone associated with Niagara University on all of our campuses is treated with respect and dignity. We will not allow any person, no matter where they are from, the language they speak, the people they love or call family, their economic or educational levels, their sex or gender, the color of their skin, their decision to serve in the military or not to be used as an excuse for why they can't survive and thrive on our campus. Working under the title of Inclusive Excellence, we are focused on being a place that actively incorporates diversity and inclusion concepts as part of our activities on and off campus. We want to ensure that when we say belonging, that the invitation is extended to all, including our neighbors. We aren't inviting people on campus to check a box. We're ensuring that our work and efforts will help prepare the next generation to support and listen to each other in this global environment. No longer can we function in isolation. We believe that all of us working in unison can and will make that happen and will help students and scholars interface respectfully with their communities and learn from past mistakes. The Catholic Church, of which Niagara University is a part, operated over half of the residential schools in Canada and about a quarter of the residential schools in the United States. And because we played such a huge role in the traumatic separation of Native children from their families and the systematic assault on their language and culture and forced assimilation, then we have to play a vital role in helping to heal the wounds and break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. It is our responsibility, and we will do nothing less. We thank our organizing committee for this event, especially our Indigenous partners. We particularly thank Joanna Weinholz, Tuscarora, Turtle Clan, for her leadership. We'd also like to acknowledge committee members Violet, Printup, Tuscarora, Bear Clan, and Hugh Burnham, Mohawk, Wolf Clan. We are also grateful for the contributions of Tuscarora Nation members Brennen Ferguson, Turtle Clan, and Renee Henry, Deer Clan. And we respectfully thank guest filmmaker Ruchatneet Printup for his insights. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you will learn from what you see and hear today, but that you will also be inspired and motivated to go forward and make the change needed. I now welcome Joanne Weinholz, an incredible educator, professor, to introduce our program tonight.
Twin Askanaha, Gafia Heka, Yariha Diati Hutnaj Gajiha, Disna, Akseswa Rakwis. My name is Hutnaj Gajiha in the Skarura or Tuscarora language, and my name is also Joanne Rickard Weinholz. I'm very happy to be here today, to be a part of this. I'm grateful that we could come together on such a difficult topic in our history, and that perhaps that we can all leave here in a better space. Today I have the honor of introducing two individuals who stepped forward on their own, and I feel that's very much a reflection of our culture this way, because we all have this understanding and this history of what happened to us. And one of the individuals was a former student of mine. I taught at our Tuscarora Elementary School for many years. And his name is Tyler Rickard. And Tyler has taken a path of not only learning, but giving back to our community in a very meaningful way. He works with traditional healing, and he's not only learning himself, but like I say, he is sharing with our community. And just as I greeted you with Twant Yscanahep, still are you at peace? This is an ancient phrase that has endured and lasted despite the boarding school history. And what it's really saying to each and every one of us when we greet this way is to say, are you at peace mentally, physically, spiritually, socially? All of us, just as Brennen had said, when we come together this way, it is very significant for us to have this understanding. And this is where Tyler is contributing to our community in a very, very meaningful, traditional way of working with the earth and the plants and the medicines this way. Along with him is his aunt, who very nicely volunteered to be a part of this, and that is Renee Henry. And she is a LMSW, or she has this, her licensed Masters of Social Work. And she works as a clinical mental health counselor in our community. And again, it's not just about a particular kind of medicine, but it is about just what I say when I think about Twant Yscanahep. It is about that mental, physical, social, emotional, bringing it and tying it all together with our traditional beliefs, along with the earth and what the Creator has provided for us. So we're very grateful today to have them here because of the serious nature that this film is going to share with you. And so there are potentials because it can be very traumatic. And so I'm gonna let both of them, perhaps both of you could come up and speak to this to help our audience. There'll be a slight change in the schedule this way because Renee is also gonna do a breathing activity to prepare us as we watch the video.
And Renee Henry, and this is my nephew Tyler. So I thought it would be important to do the breathing activity prior to seeing the documentary, only because for myself, it was very triggering the first few times I've seen it. You can't hear me? Okay. So it's important to do the breathing activity before seeing unforeseen tears because it can be very triggering, and it was very triggering for myself the first few times I've seen it. So, do you want to add anything before we do the breathing activity?
No, that sounds good.
Okay. So, what I'm going to show you is a butterfly hug, it's called. So it's a bilateral stimulation so that if you get triggered, it'll process through your brain. So it requires you to do diaphragmatic breathing, which is breathing below your belly button. So when you breathe in, you're going to push your stomach out, and you're going to cross your fingers across your chest. And you're going to deep breathe in, pushing your belly out like you're blowing up a balloon. And take a deep breath. And when you exhale, let it be longer than your inhale, and it's like deflating the balloon in your stomach, and let it out. So I'll try it again. Take a deep breath in, pushing your abdomen out. Hold it for a second, and then deflate your stomach. Exhale. So if you happen to get triggered during the film, I'd like for you to do that to help yourself. And Tyler and I will both be on standby as well. If anybody needs to go out, we can go in the back out there and talk, or we can help you in any way that we can, okay? So if you need us, you can even just raise your hand if you need us to come over, and we can walk you over there. All right? Okay, thank you. Yahweh.
I would like to acknowledge Dr. Colley, who was instrumental in bringing all of us together. And when she approached me about the subject of the boarding residential school history, I think I was very honest with her and just said, I'd rather not, because it's difficult. And so we got to thinking about it and talking and so on and so forth. Make a long story short, I knew about Unseen Tears because my cousin is our guest today. And he created this documentary that really helps to explain what this history is about. And I thought that would be a great thing to bring to the university, because you have Orange Shirt Day coming up here. And what I didn't want was, I didn't want to see the orange shirts go out to the students and you had no idea. It was like, great, I got a new t-shirt, and that would be about it. Instead, I'm grateful that you're here, and I hope you're open to hearing the story, and that you will be able to articulate when you wear the shirt what it means. And so Dr. Colley, along with myself, we put together a team consisting of the university, many professors, administrators, and people from our confederacy, to address how we could best inform and help people to understand this history. So we have our guest, Ruchatneet Printup. He's Tuscarora clan. He recently graduated summa cum laude in May of 2023 from Syracuse University with a BFA in film from the College of Visual and Performing Arts. He resides on the Tuscarora Nation outside of Niagara Falls. It's about very, very close here, and has 2 children and 7 grandchildren. While at Syracuse University, he received multiple awards: one of 12 university scholars, Visual Performing Arts Scholar, Haudenosaunee Promise Scholar, Invest in Success Scholar, Sundance Film Festival Ignite Program recipient, Source Grant recipient, Syracuse Abroad Grant recipient, Indigenous valedictorian, and was selected to serve as the 2023 commencement speaker for the College of Visual and Performing Arts. His vision as a filmmaker is to infuse his indigenous philosophies, values, and culture in his stories to inspire connectedness within humanity. Please welcome Ruchatneet Printup.
Thank you, Joanne. I appreciate that. So the film that you're about to see was a film that we started in 2008. We had a short, there was a grant that was put out by Squeaky Wheel. If those of you who are familiar with the film scene in Western New York, Squeaky Wheel is a major supporter of independent filmmakers, and they had put out a grant, and they were asking for 4 films that dealt with different issues, and one of them being some racial issues. And so at the time I was working for the Native Center in Buffalo, and my executive director approached me and asked me about submitting a proposal to do a film. So we talked about some different topics, and he said, you know, we're in a community meeting, and one of the elders started talking about boarding school, and just kind of immediately kind of shut down. And he said, so he was the one that really approached me about exploring this. Now you got to remember, at this time, and again, it may be new to you, but at that time, even within the Native community, it was not being talked about, especially on the American side. And so I submitted a proposal, and we were selected out of, they selected 4 projects out of 29 applicants, and we were one of them. And so I was partnered with a filmmaker that was a graduate student from the University of Buffalo. His name is Ron Douglas. And we worked together to do this film. I arranged the majority of these interviews. He did the filming. He did the editing like the very fundamentals of editing, and I was just really overlooking to make sure that we weren't being misrepresented in some way, or that there was something being shown that I didn't think would be appropriate for us to show. And so the film premiered in 2009, and we had over 400 people show up at Buffalo State, primarily community members. And right from the very first time we filmed, I realized that there was this uncovered history that we had not been talking about to these survivors of these schools. Nobody had asked them what happened to them. And the film was originally going to be 10 minutes, and we expanded it to 30. And it could have easily been a feature with the amount of interviews that we had. And I thought at first, like 30 minutes wasn't going to be great, you know, like it was a compromise to even just do 30 minutes. But what I found is that this length of film has been really effective to use in the education system, because it's only 30 minutes. And so a lot of professors are able to show them in their classrooms, and it just seems much more accessible than if we had done a longer film, which we had fully intended to do at that time. And so, so that's a little background on the film, and I'll let you watch it, and then we'll have more discussion about it after. The first federal boarding school was started in 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, more commonly known as the Carlisle Indian School. And it's a military base. And so these schools were first started out of the Department of War. And so if you think in the late 1800s, the US was still battling the Plains Indians in North and South Dakota. They were still battling the Seminoles down in Florida. Geronimo was incarcerated around this time. And so, you know, this General Pratt come up with this idea because they had some success working with Native inmates and kind of re-educating them. And so he's the one that pitched really this concept of let's take the children and strip them of their language and culture. And their main purpose was that they were going to get out of these schools and that they would just be mainstreamed. With the eventual intention of being is that they were going to remove the Native people from the land, and these children would return. But that's not actually what happened. So in Tuscarora alone, just in Carlisle, we had over 200 of our community members that went to Carlisle. So what they were finding was happening is that over 95% of these kids would get out of these schools and they would go back to their communities. They weren't mainstreaming, they weren't, but what was happening, as you could see in the film, is they were coming back not having been raised by parents, not having their language, not having their culture, and then they were trying to then become a part of a community that they weren't raised in. And so the US closed Carlisle in 1918 thinking that they had failed to achieve what they had wanted. But what they didn't realize was that they had created all of these social issues for these communities. And so you won't find a Native community in North America that wasn't affected by these schools. The United States had over 500 Native boarding schools. Canada had between 130 and 140. And so every single Native community in North America lost children to these schools. And so, you know, they touched on it in this film of bringing back children that had not been raised with parents. And then we're put into situations where now they were being asked to become parents when they had no mentors. They hadn't, many of them didn't have a family structure to even look up to. And so what would happen is they would come in and they would marry into the community, and they might marry somebody that didn't go to boarding school, but they were still bringing all of these issues with them into the family. And so, so those are a lot of the social issues that our communities are still dealing with to this day. One of the things, some of the major things, even in the interviews, we had interviews that we didn't show in this, obviously. We had probably over 70 hours of interviews. And I remember one elder woman getting up and saying when she went home, she had no idea what it was to be a mother, what it was to be a partner, and that she was watching TV to try to relearn how to be a parent. And so some of the things that were happening, as you've seen with the young girl that had been getting sexually abused, and she couldn't express what was happening to her without this harsh punishment. And so many of these children were coming out of there, and they had been taught that you don't express yourself, you don't express emotion, you don't express needs. And so, those types of coping mechanisms were coming into the community of not talking, not communicating. The other thing is that there was fierce punishment going on in these schools. So these, as you could see with that young girl, that was an unusual thing for kids to be punished severely for things that, we wouldn't punish kids for. And so there was this severe punishment and this kind of extreme punishment. And those are also things that came back with these kids of not knowing how to really discipline, because they had been disciplined so severely while they were in there. Now how do they do that with their own children when this was what was taught to them as young children? And so that's when one of the psychologists alluded to the fact of how it brought in other things, the sexual abuse, the domestic violence, those kinds of things that were happening in these schools, and that now they were coming back into our communities. And so in 2009, when, like I had mentioned, we had we weren't talking about it in our community at that time. And we really, in most of the communities on the American side, weren't talking about it at that time. And so when this film came out in 2009, and we had over 400 community members come out, and some of them were survivors that came as well, it just really made us so much more aware of things in our culture that really weren't part of our culture. It made us much more aware of things that had happened to us and how our community had responded. And there's a term that's come out more, and some of you may be aware of it, but it's called colonization, of how colonization was happening to the indigenous people. And so it helped to give us kind of a roadmap of how to decolonize ourselves from what happened in these boarding schools, and how some of the things that had become normal in our community, we quickly realized were not normal, and that we needed to talk about that and address that. And the first step was really kind of the awareness. And so, that's really, when we went out and interviewed these elders, it's very difficult for them to talk about very personal things that happened to them. And the way I expressed to them was that it would be much more powerful for their children or grandchildren to see it firsthand than to say this happened to them, as opposed to the person that it happened to expressing what happened. And so we were using it, so that's how we got a lot of the elders to step forward, was to use it as a historical kind of testimony, that the future generations would be able to have going forward. And so, you know, as Dr. is it Miner had expressed, is that, you know, in my research, similar to hers, in Canada, over 50% of the schools were operated by the Catholic Church. And in my research, about half of the schools in the American side were being run by the Catholic Church. But they weren't the only ones. There were a lot of other denominations. But the Catholic Church, about all the other denominations combined, was still less than the amount of schools being run by the Catholic Church. In 2022, the Pope came to Canada and publicly apologized for the schools that were being run in Canada by the Catholic Church. And Canada also, in the early 2000s, just before we started this documentary, had settled a class action suit in Canada because Native people were taking some of these faiths to court. And so Canada made the decision that they would settle a class action suit. And basically, if they signed off on it, then they couldn't pursue the denominations that were running these schools. And so Canada was given, if you attended Native residential school, then you were given $3,000 for 1 year. And then you were given $3,000 for every year that you attended as a settlement. And you were also given, and there was also another process if you had been sexually, physically, emotionally abused, that they were taking testimonies for that. And so some of their largest settlements were about like $300,000 if students had also experienced other forms of abuse that they could prove. And the Prime Minister of Canada also issued a formal apology to the Native nations that were all affected by this policy. On the American side, it has not fared well. The United States has not issued a formal apology for what had happened. Under Biden, Deb Haaland is the current head of the Department of Interior, and she's Pueblo. She started a commission right now to take testimony on boarding schools. So I believe there is a board right now. But there has been no settlement per se that Canada had done. And no formal apology at the president level for what happened to these Native communities. And you know, in Carlisle, like I had mentioned, we had about 200 community members go to Carlisle alone, and I would say even more went to Thomas Indian School. And then we had a fair amount that went to the Mohawk Institute. And there were other schools as well that our community members went to along the eastern seaboard. And one of the things that the film we didn't address was the harsh amount of labor that these children went through. So these children were basically worked every day that they were in these schools. And they were running huge farms. And almost all of the kids that you talked to, even though they would have chickens and orchards and what, were not being fed the food that they were growing. The school was selling the merchandise that these kids were laboring for to pay for the school. And most of the education that they were getting, when you really look at the types of education that they were getting, they really weren't educating them like we would see in a typical education. They were primarily being trained as, with their labor. The women and a lot of times were being trained to be like housemaids and things like that. When you even looked at Carlisle's history, the vast majority of the students never graduated with a diploma when they left there. And I was just doing some research, which I wasn't aware of just prior to coming here, was that even the Mohawk Institute didn't start a full day of school until 1963 with the students. They were being worked primarily every day. They were being worked. We interviewed a woman that had been at Thomas Indian School, and she was taken out when she was a teenager because her father had remarried and he had 6 more children, and she was kind of brought home to help take care of the other children. And she said it was easier taking care of 6 children as a 14-year-old than it was working at Thomas Indian School. And so what we found in our communities at times is that there's this kind of unrealistic, in a way, kind of work ethic of like, that you could never do enough. And we see that as kind of an extension of how these children are being raised and how they pass that down to their children. And they very rarely had time to just do fun things. It was unusual for them. They'd get the occasional movie or something like that, but that was another thing that many of them that we interviewed said was challenging for them when they got out of there, was like just to enjoy doing fun things, because that wasn't really built in to how they were being raised. And there was a conscious effort to break these children from their culture. Thomas Indian School didn't have a particular denomination that overlooked Thomas Indian School, but they had a rotation of 7 different denominations that came in and worked with the kids. And the kids weren't allowed to leave for ceremonies that were there in their community. But if it was for a Christian event, then accommodations could be made. And there was also a lot of information in the records of these kids that if they, to kind of break that bond, if they were coming from a traditional family, try to break the connection they had with their families, there was a fair amount of psychological abuse happening, where if they felt a child was acting up in class or wasn't adapting to the school environment, then they would tell them that a family member was coming to visit them that weekend, and they would tell the family not to come. And then they would tell the kids that their family just didn't show up. And it was interesting to look at some of these records, because they were so blatant about it in the record keeping, about what they were doing. And part of that is as you've seen when they talked about students getting surgery while they're at school, most of the parents were never notified if that was happening to their children. So what they were doing is, when the children would get sent to the school, is they would basically be giving over guardianship to the school. So the school had no legal responsibility to notify family if their kids were having surgery or something had happened to them. And so there were instances where parents wouldn't even know if a child had passed away until years later, because the school had never notified them that their child hadn't survived. And so you're seeing a lot of that right now emerging as their, and some of you may be aware and some of you may not be, but they've begin to uncover undocumented grave sites at these schools. And they've been finding large grave sites, undocumented grave sites at these schools. And so there's, I didn't look at the current number, but it was in the neighborhood of like between 8,000 and 10,000 remains had been found at these schools that were undocumented. And they had only started to just touch on some of the schools. It had only been a handful of schools that they had been to with this ground penetrating sonar. And so and they have not even begun to even address that on the American side. This is on the Canadian side. And so, what started off as a very simple documentary in 2008, not knowing kind of what we were uncovering at that time, has really become much more talked about it. There's much more awareness now within our Native communities on both the Canadian and the American side. And it has really taken our work, our own Native community, work such as this film to kind of bring that to light. And so, some of the work that Joanne Weinholtz and Dr. Colley of trying to extend that education out, because there has not been a lot of education just around Native history in general, even more so in the United States than Canada. And just not really educating the true history of what's happened to the indigenous people as North America has been colonized. And so, what we've had to do in our own Native communities is we've had to educate ourselves. If we don't educate ourselves, then it's not happening. So we're finding, certainly in our community, we're doing a much better job of educating our community members from a young age. And we're always looking for other ways to educate our community. We've also had universities that have taken a bigger and broader initiative to bring more Indigenous education into their curriculums and into the course offerings that they're doing. And that's certainly one of our goals when we go out and we reach out and we educate, is we're looking to educate because we know that education isn't happening in the mainstream education system. Right now in New York State, the only required year I think is 4th grade, where they have to do some education on I don't even think it's required that they even do education on Native people from New York State, but many of them will get like a basic education of the Iroquois in New York State. But in some states, there's many states that don't have any federally recognized Native nations left in those states. And so you'll find a lot of people are having minimal exposure to Native people in general. So, part of this is that I think we have, part of our survival has been to kind of be invisible. We found that was more beneficial for us to almost be invisible. So we're not a people that's out there loud but we're finding that really has to change. And that's why we're coming out more and talking, and that we can't be invisible. We know that a lot of our philosophies and culture and way of looking at the things around us are really needed right now at this time, what we refer to as Mother Earth. with the global environmental crisis that we're facing right now. It's really forcing us out and being much more vocal, just for the survival of all of the environment around us. And so, so I was asked to speak till about 6 o'clock, and then we'd open it up to questions or any comments that anybody might have. There's a lot of things that I really didn't touch on as part of this history. But if anybody had any other questions or comments, now's the time.
So does anyone have a question to start us off with? Yes.
Regarding...
Can I ask you to stand up first, please?
So regarding Prime Minister Harper's apology and Trump's visit to Canada for holidays, how do you take that as a man, as a native? Like, how do you guys really take that? Do you think it's meaningful, or do you agree with, forgive me if I'm misremembering his name, but I believe it was Elliot Tallchief. He said that it's a bit insincere. It's sort of, how can it be? It's inherently insincere. Do you agree with that, or do you think it is a little bit more significant?
So if I understood your question correctly, you're asking when the Prime Minister of Canada apologized versus how Mr. Tallchief looked at it, how do we view that, the difference?
That's a good question. I think, many of our community members that had been to boarding school. So the Mohawk Institute closed in 1970, and Thomas Indian School closed, I believe, in 1957, 59. And so right now, most of our community members that had attended are typically in their 70s to 80s right now. But there are also schools that went much later. I think for me, I think the apology is important. I think that acknowledgement is important. But I think along with that is what are the actions beyond that? And, even as a filmmaker, it can be very difficult to really address the true history of, let's just talk about the United States, since we're in the United States right now. And, when you look at like the National Geographic Channel and things like that would produce certain documentaries, they'll limit the amount of hard topics to talk about, especially when it comes to Indigenous people in the United States, because they're being funded a lot by subscribers, and they don't want to turn their audience off either. And so, without the United States having policies that enforce education to educate them about these types of topics, it's very difficult for there to be like a volunteer effort to do that. And so, but the fact that there isn't even an apology to begin with, it's like, then how do we even start the discussion about how are we going to educate the larger population? And so, what they're more likely to show in media is like some of the causes of these boarding schools than really showing, and they're just like, oh, they're not doing well, but they're not really talking about the intentional genocidal policies that these communities have been through that have made it difficult for them to recover. And without having more of those resources and education to uplift them, it can be very difficult. And so, those are the things that, I would like to see happen, is more education And what I'm seeing in Indian country really is our own communities. It really depends on the health of the community of educating our own people. And so that it's with that information and that knowledge that we're able to kind of take that next step.
Okay, I'll just add my 2 cents here. I think that, first of all, for Mr. Talji, you know, I respect, he's the person who lived through it, and this is what he feels, and I respect that. But what I feel is that it says, to me, it says volumes. I mean, I'm glad that the Prime Minister of Canada did that. I would like to see the United States President stand before the American population and educate the American population and sense that way, along with Indigenous people, to give that perspective and to say, hey, this was a wrong, this should have never happened, and to acknowledge it. And so I think that that would be really important. And it would, you know, to me, so many times those of us that are on Facebook, the numbers would pop up of how many children's bodies were found over across the river here. And it was shocking, it's shocking. 10,000 and some bodies last I saw. I can't understand why that is not on the news. And you should be asking that too, because you should be saying, if that's not being shown, what else isn't being shown? And you are the future this way. And so you need to be thinking about that. So I appreciate the question though. Another question? Comment? Yes, Ellen?
Were there parents that refused to give up their children, and what happened to those parents or those children?
Okay, can you say that again?
Were there parents that refused to give up their children, and what happened to those parents and those children?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what each community had, they usually had like a social, what we'd kind of refer to in more modern terms as like, it would be like a social worker that would be assigned to a community, and their job was to remove children from the community and get them into these boarding schools. And a lot of the families that were really being especially hit were those that had become single parent families. And so as you heard Sally General talk about, was when her mother passed away, the social work put an incredible amount of pressure on the father to remove the children from the home, and he was saying, I can raise my children. And so, but they come under a huge amount of pressure, and in some cases, in some communities, they were even much more aggressive than even, like there's documented cases of Hopi fathers getting jailed for not sending their children to boarding school. So in some cases, parents were imprisoned for not sending their kids if the social worker deemed that those kids needed to go. And that's why you see in Sally's situation where her father was still in contact, so he knew his son, had gotten word that his son was being held in the clinic there, and he went and advocated for his son to be taken out. Now those are kind of best case situations where the father had an idea about what was happening, but it was in those cases where the parents, our family didn't have any idea what was going on. And so, you know, we certainly had people in our community, if they were being pressured to go to boarding school, talk about stories where if they seen somebody come into the community that looked like, they would usually be dressed in a suit, so they would usually know that it was like a government employee or servant, and so the children would hide. They would hide under the porch and whatnot to try to keep from being taken away. You'll see in a lot of the records in Carlisle that they'll list that they were orphans, but usually orphan meant that they might have had just one parent. And one of the things that happened a lot, and it still happens of course now, but even more so, with these earlier generations is that a fair amount of women didn't survive childbirth. And so mothers would die during childbirth. And those were children that were really being earmarked. They were much more aggressive at going after those children. And one of the women that we had interviewed said that they talked to her parents and said, you know, we have running water, we're going to feed your children, we're going to educate them, and which was not the case when they were sent there. And so they were trying to convince the parents that they were going to do right by them, but that's not what was happening to the kids. And she said herself, she goes, I would have gladly gave up running water to be with my parent. That wasn't important to me. And, but there was a lot of pressure on these families from these social workers to remove the children.
And I recall Lori Quigley that you saw on the documentary or on the film. She told me of a case down at the Thomas Indian School where there was a woman, she was a grown woman, and she really resented her mother because her mother never came to see her. And they would kind of play on her and let her know that, oh, your mother, she didn't show up, your mother didn't want to come, your mother didn't want to see you. And later on, when they were looking in the records, they found out the mother was showing up. And they were telling the mother that the kids refused to see her. And so, I can't do it. Every time I talk about this, I cry. So what happened is that this woman died, and that's when her daughter, who resented her, and it made her angry throughout her life towards her mother. And after she passed, that's when the daughter found out that her mother had been coming to see them. And then she carried this guilt for treating her mother that way. If that isn't sick, I don't know what is. And yet, you never hear these stories. So it wasn't just that physical abuse, it was that mental abuse too.
Yeah, we had interviewed a guy. He was actually, again, all of our Native communities were being sent to these boarding schools. So this was happening in the Dakotas, and he had been sent to boarding school. He confronted his mom when he was being changed from boarding schools. He was changed from an elementary type boarding school to a high school. And he went home with his mother for one summer, and he confronted her about not coming to see him, not inviting him home. And she goes, no, I did reach out to you. I did contact the school, and he didn't believe her. And so when he was 70 years old, somebody had reached out to him to ask permission to go back into his records. And when they went back into his records, they found letters from his mother. They found documentation in here that the school had even cashed checks that she had sent for him in order to have transportation home, that the school just cashed and never gave to him. And again, it was that same breaking of that bond with his mother. And he said it affected his relationship with women in general after feeling like his mother had just abandoned him in school. And had also affected his own ability to connect with his children after having not had a connection, with his parents. And these were the types of things that were happening to kind of break that connection to their culture and to their community.
Good question over here.
My question is, why do you think that there's such a difference on the road to reconciliation between Canada and the United States? Like, I know I'm a Canadian, and I've taken many courses that are mandatory about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous history, but to hear that some states might not even know what an Indigenous person looks like, it's just crazy to hear. Like, why do you think that there's such a difference when we're such close neighbors?
You know, that's a good question. I think one of the things that, so there's a lot of different factors with that. One of them is that the population in the United States for Indigenous people is less than 2%. In Canada, it's around 6 or 7%, which is a big difference. And Canada already has such a small population, the vast majority of their population living close to the border with the United States. But if you go into parts of Canada, the vast majority of them are Indigenous people, like when you go into the Northern Territories of Canada. The other thing that's really helped Canada is Quebec. Quebec has a province that's French speaking. And so they make all of these different allocations for a different culture, a different language. And so they've been able to argue in Canada to get money set aside to be able to teach their Indigenous language, which is French, to be able to teach their culture. And so the Native communities have been able to piggyback on that, saying, well, if that's the law in Canada, then we can teach our language and we can teach our culture, and there's money available for that because Quebec has already paved the way for that in Canada. Where in the United States, there's been this effort since it began that English is going to be the dominant language in the United States. They don't, in their curriculum, they don't encourage diversity in the United States. Their language programs aren't really designed to really make people fluent in the language, where you have, obviously European countries, they'll get out 3 different languages they'll know by the time they get out of high school. The United States is not trying to do that. They're not really trying to create multilingual speakers in the United States. And so that's hurt us because we're in the same situation when we're trying to educate our people in our language, that they're not making it easy for us because it's not even built into the curriculum for students to learn more than one language. And so we're pushing up against a dominating English mindset in the United States. And so that's really hurt our communities. When you've talked to other communities, one thing that's really hurt our communities has been Head Start. Because our children are going into these Head Start programs as little babies, and they might have had fluent speakers, and then they go into Head Start and they're being taught in English. And so they said that has really affected some of our communities where they did have a stronger amount of traditional speakers, but Head Start has really impacted on their young people because they're not even getting them until 5 or 6 years old where they're becoming fluent in their language. And so you can create immersion Head Start. Like, these are possible to create, but it takes a huge amount of effort to do those in the United States. Where in Canada, it's built into their policies. And I have to say, part of that is the population size of Indigenous people, and part of it is the influence of French-speaking Quebec that's helped Canada. But I'll have to say that Canada has also been in world court suffering a number of human rights violations against Indigenous people. For years, they would not acknowledge the Native women in their communities. They would only enroll through the man. And if a Native woman married a non-Native man, then her kids wouldn't be enrolled. And so they had a lot of human rights violations against Indigenous women, and it's perpetuated even now with this missing murdered Indigenous women epidemic that's going on. And in the United States, it's also created problems because within Native communities, the federal laws have been that you can't, it's difficult to convict a non-Native person in a Native community that comes in there and commits an offense. It goes into a court system that's very ambiguous, and so that's why a lot of these crimes that were happening in Indigenous communities weren't really being prosecuted because the laws were so ambiguous when they would go into a Native territory. And it really created a target, really, for these communities by targeting things happening there and then not getting taken care of properly in the court system. And we've just found notoriously we have not had justice within the court system. And so, you know, that's been another layer of issues that we've had. But thank you for that, yeah.
I kind of would like to go down the path though of language, you know, how our in that situation, and there's so much more that can be said about this. I myself spent some time with women in our community at one point in trying to learn the language from an elder. And another woman that I would talk with in our community, I knew that she had gone to school and she would always be like, oh, nobody wants to hear my story. And I was always pressing her, no, I want to hear about it. And one day she surprised me. She had her daughter write her story all out and she shared it. And with the language, she told the story. And she went to school over in Canada at the Spanish school, I believe it's called. And she told the story of how when they arrived, they received a number. And so she was never referred to using her name. They only called her, I think her number was 50 or 51, I don't remember now. And can you imagine saying that to a child? You know, that's your number. Your number's 7, that's it. Hey, 7. You know, get in line, or whatever. And so this is the way she grew up. And she told me that if she spoke her language, they would take a pin and stick it through your tongue. And the woman that I was working with the other women in our community, she told the story about how in the middle of the night, her and her friend would get up and they'd sneak and they'd go in the closet and they would speak to each other in Tuscarora. She said, I can still see her. She was so animated. Oh, it just felt so good on my ears. And so, you know, as a child, to have to sneak just to speak your language. And so it's quite remarkable what's happening at Tuscarora. We have a very dedicated group of people working very, very hard to bring our language, to keep it alive. And it's, in my lifetime, I would say it's probably at the healthiest state that we've ever experienced, which is really incredible. And so the fact that's being taught here on campus, if you want to take that course, Tuscarora language, and Brennen's teaching Tuscarora culture.
Yeah, that's true what Joanne said is virtually every boarding school in Canada, the children were assigned a number and that's how they were referred to during their entire education system. The United States, as far as I know, didn't do that. But there were pros and cons on both sides. At the Thomas Indian School, when you came into that school, you were really separated out into your age group. You might have been maybe 1 or below you. And so you didn't have, so if you came in there with siblings, the only time you might have seen them is across the room in a cafeteria. So you wouldn't really, you didn't have that close bond with your siblings. At the Mohawk Institute, most of the kids were put on the same floor together and they would have a more broad range, which is good and bad, because there was also sexual abuse going on in these schools. And so, which was being passed down, as you heard, from the employees, and then that perpetuated into the kids, you know, having been sexually abused, and they begin to not know healthy boundaries with the younger kids that they were going to school with. And so you found that, like in Thomas Indian School, a lot of times the siblings didn't know each other well. They would just see each other across the room in the cafeteria. Their real family became those kids that they were actually in class with. And even as they became adults, the kids that they usually kept more in touch with are the kids that were in their grade. They were closer to them than they were to their own siblings. And so that was part of the issue with getting them to come out and speak about their experience, because they felt like they were speaking against their family when they talked about their experience at the boarding school. As dysfunctional as it was, they still had this bond with these other kids because that's all they knew. And so they felt like they were talking against their own family. And it's kind of how it messed with their mind, you know, not really thinking about, well, what actually really happened to them, you know. And that's something that we didn't put in there that Elliot Talchik had talked about, because he was confronted when we had the premiere at Buff State by some of his classmates that came, and he said there was a part of me, I did love my classmates. He said, but who would want to be raised by anybody other than your parents, you know? And he was kind of confronting them on, you know, not to make it more than it was, even though he loved the classmates, because those were his family at that point. So it created a lot of very mixed kind of, you know, just that experience of family was so unconventional to what we would experience today.
Yes.
I just would like to share something. I'm Agnes Bruno, Ruchatneet.
Did you want a mic? They won't be able to hear you if you're making a broad statement.
I can speak loud, but not this loud. Okay, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I'm not holding my breath for anything for the United States right at this moment. Today, what's happening today is Russia is taking children from the country next to them. They are taking children, only children, and doing to them what they said the United States did to the native people here. So don't hold your breath that this can't happen to any one of you or your family. Just hearing that sickens me. And there are all these children being held in Russia right today. If you're going to say a prayer for anyone, say it for these children. Because I know people that went to these boarding schools, and the stories they tell me is beyond belief. You can't share with them without having some empathy. And all these children are the same way what happened to Native people are happening to these children in Russia. They're being taught to be Russian. And they said they learned it from the United States, what they did to Native children. Yeah.
So this is my mom, and what she's saying is true, is that, so this residential school system went around the world after the United States instituted it. So it was established in Africa, it was established in Australia, in Russia, and wherever there were indigenous people that had to be dealt with. These schools were modeled after Carlisle. And so Canada modeled it after Carlisle. And so, you know, if you look at most of the indigenous people around the world, they will talk about having also had experienced similar things in this policy going around.
And so, Nyawa, to my aunt, because that's really powerful, because you're taking what we're learning from a historical perspective and applying it for what's happening today. And that's powerful, because all of us have a responsibility this way. So we appreciate that. I think our time, we need to move along here. And so I want to say Nyawa, which means thank you for your questions or comments, and especially for Ruchatneet, because this film has really helped in so many ways. Those of you sitting in the audience, just so you know, and I hope you go home or you share with your fellow students, but you also, when you go home back to your families, I hope it's something you share, but in your sharing, you can also say you can go to YouTube, as it is, you can view it on YouTube. I think it's in 3 parts.
It's in 3 parts on YouTube. The director for this film, Ron Douglas, posted it. It's in a 3-part So all you have to search is Unseen Tears, and you'll see part 1, 2, and 3 on YouTube.
Yeah, so that's something you need to be aware of as well. And so it's also showing you the power of what, to me, what Ruchatneet has done in selecting the career path that you're on right now and going to Syracuse University and taking something like this and taking this knowledge and applying it in a very meaningful way. And so I encourage the young people sitting here to reflect on that for yourself as well. So.
Yeah, I never really thought about, in my younger years, I was involved more in acting work, and then I co-produced this documentary in 2009, and I really didn't, when I was thinking about changing, I was in human service for a long time, and I just really needed to change, and I do a lot of meditating, and it kind of meditated to me that I could go to Syracuse University and be a film director. First time I had ever thought about it was in 2018. And this work on this documentary had really helped me to get into Syracuse, and really my main emphasis is to direct feature films, but also writing and creating feature films that really are infused with indigenous ways of thinking and looking at the world into like more modern types of movies. And so that was really, you know, I knew from the first day I was there that I was on the right track, and I just had a great experience at Syracuse, and just and now graduated, and now you know, working on my projects.
And he's not trying to steal any students out to Syracuse. But,
No.
but he's also going to be showing 2 films November 6th.
November 6th. Yeah.
Here on campus. So if you're interested, look for that information through Dr. Riley's.
Yeah. So they're going to be narrative films. They're not documentary films. They're films I wrote and directed. They're scripted short films, 16 and 20 minutes. They were both filmed in in my community of Tuscarora.
And so I just wanted to acknowledge Ruchatneet for his work, and I really appreciate that Tyler and Renee were here today. It was reassuring. I'm probably one of the people I should have been sitting there going, tacky. But anyway, I was thinking maybe I better start doing that. But anyway, we really, really appreciate you being here and taking the time, because it does matter. And we have a student here, a fellow student, Violet. But before we do that, I think we would like to give Ruchatneet a round of applause.
Can you hear me? Chwan Askanaha, Kiatha Wudenajas, Agis Sita Ujira, Hopnenis, Garuda, Ekato, Gairaka, Hapkanahalata. Hello, my name is Violet Clamp. I am Tuscarora Bear Clan. I am also a Niagara University student here. You can find me living here on campus on the weekdays, but then usually on the weekends I go home. So I am the designer of the t-shirt. I'll just show it first before I get talking about it. So, and then there's before going into the shirt design that I made, I wanted to first give some background on the history of the orange shirt. In 1963, 6-year-old Phyllis Webstad was attending her first day of school at St. Joseph's Mission Residential School outside of Williams Lake, British Columbia. Before being taken to the school with her grandmother had given her a new orange shirt to wear during school, which had been a gift because at that time it was not very common to get new clothes, especially living on the reservation. And within the first day at St. Joseph's, all of her belongings were taken away, including the orange shirt. And her orange shirt was replaced with the uniform given to her by the institution. In later years, her experience was used to start showing the history of residential boarding schools, and now it's something that how it's still something that affects Indigenous peoples of North America to this day. The orange shirt represents what was taken away at those schools, and now that we are starting the healing process and going back to the things that were tried to be taken away from us, like our history and our culture. So now into the design that I made. I felt with this specific design, of course, to show the significance of our kids. That was one thing important to all Indigenous peoples and was also affected during this era. Before the boarding school era, our people used to wear a traditional regalia every day, not just for ceremonies or shows, so I thought it was important to draw them in their traditional clothing. So, the girl is shown protecting the younger boy, which is showing how many kids are now being led onto the correct life of being an Omohoi person. The little boy is actually modeled after my friend's son, who knows how to sing, he knows our social dances, and can understand his language. He has grown up immersed in our traditional ways, which is something that many didn't get at that time. When I see him during ceremonies, it makes me think of how many children did not get to participate in things like this, and how much our culture and language is going to thrive with the newer generation growing up in the same environment as him. I was hanging out with his family a couple weeks ago, and he told me that having his hair in a braid is one of his favorite things. The zigzag design can be seen in older beadwork and clover during times that were dark, like times of war. I put it in the design to show the uncertainty of this era, because as sad as it is to say, many of the kids at the schools did not return home, and a lot of our culture and language was lost because of these schools. But around the uncertainty is now unity, not just of Indigenous boarding school survivors, but of all the people who want to acknowledge this past and create a better future for all people, which is shown by the figures holding hands around the uncertainty. The design is similar to the one on the George Washington wampum belt. On the back of the shirt, it has the words listening, learning, acknowledging for a better future, which was actually a group decision. We had struggled trying to figure out whether words should or shouldn't be a part of this design, but we had found similar wording on another orange shirt design. And later I was talking with my mom, and she mentioned adding for a better future to show the efforts that all of us here today are making in order for this not to happen in history and make a better relationship with all people from all walks of life. Altogether, this design shows the efforts that are being made throughout North America between governments, institutions, and Indigenous peoples, as well as campuses like Niagara University to make the space more welcoming and understanding of the backgrounds of Indigenous students on campus. I want to say nyawa to everyone here willing to take that step in understanding Indigenous history. I also want to say nyawa to Dr. Colley as well as Joanne for including me in this project. I'm thankful to have been able to have a role in helping something so important for the campus. Nyawa.
So before we close, I just wanted to say nyawa to all of our presenters today, Joanne and Ruchatneet, and of course Renee and Tyler for being here, for our support, and to Violet for all of her hard work, and also the staff here at NU that collaborated with our community in order to make this happen. So I opened our meeting here this afternoon, and in our custom, when you open a meeting, you also have to close it. And so I'll use a lot of the same terminology. And towards the end, you'll hear a phrase, "Got to get her guasna, can you and what to get her custody." So I add that on towards the end, meaning that since we brought our minds together, I include that phrase, which means like to have a good mind as we separate our minds, meaning like when we go home, that we keep this goodness about our minds. Una thwata na tutariha kanyut ekina ratas. Una wakahaf kagurihwaya ekihra kanika urihwa. Una hasna na wat igwa wat na ina makatwaini. The thwatiga gafne kanika diga wadakya. Una hasna igwa ni rutra isna natwat na haratas isna yagwadi huwa tata. Twaa ikwageha na afnakya. Una nekwa and what diga harutra isna wayutra yagwadi huwa tata hat igwa abufna. Isna twaa kanika yakiawik. Twaa nekwa dawachuha kia net aryagote. Una nekwa twaa igwadi huwa tata ha hetak diga yagwa stapkya. kaira ya gehruna ya kiguana skana dario haka digehragwasna tisna haka digehragwasna na nikwa derutra una twai igwari hua tata ha rawdiafna tanahiwakya tisna una twai igwari hua tata twai ha rawdiya kiana ha ufna kena era tisna urahliga una twai igwari hua tata haka digehragwasna na kenyu anwa digehrakaski anak dia pernah kat ni buat tiga rona, ona takut tiga rat, ona hayat tu.
See the shirts that Violet just showed up here, and so this is for the people here today. So you can get one of the shirts on your way out this afternoon. And we want to say Yawa for attending this. And I really appreciate that you took your busy schedule that you came. And I wish you a great year at the university. Yawa.